Welcome to the 11th podcast and the first of a series on environmental policy instruments. In this podcast, we will answer the question, why do we need environmental policy instruments? We will cover market failures more formally than in the previous podcast. In particular, we will compare the laissez-faire outcome with the solution that a social planner would choose. And also we will classify policy instruments after giving you a short overview of what exists. Before we start, we need some assumptions. Previously, we looked at the output decision of a firm, how much it produces given the market price. Now, we assume that the production of a firm I causes emissions denoted by EI. So, each firm has a second choice variable, the first one being production quantity. And this second choice variable is the reduction of emissions. We call it emissions abatement and denote it by A. Therefore, production costs depend on both the produced quantity Qi and abatement Ai of each firm I. The cost function has several properties. First, we assume that the cost function is increasing in both variables Qi and Ai, which means that its first derivatives are strictly positive. And the cost function is either linear or convex in both variables, which gives non-negative second derivatives. What about the cross derivative? We assume that it is equal or greater than 0. Most probably it is greater than 0. Which means that the more output we produce, the more costly will abatement become for an additional emission reduction. But this depends a lot on the technology which underlies the abatement process. If the cross derivative is 0, that only means that there is no influence of production on the marginal cost of abatement, which is quite restrictive. Furthermore, we assume that emissions EI are positively related to production, but negatively related to abatement AI. This is pretty straightforward. So EI is a function of Qi and AI, and the first derivative of EI with respect to Qi is strictly positive, while the first derivative with respect to AI is strictly negative. That only means that the more you produce, the more you generate emissions, so you pollute, and the more you abate, the less you emit, of course. Also, aggregate emissions E are the sum of firm level emissions, EI, and impose monetary damages, DE, on society, which is considered as a negative externality. And this damage function can be either linear or convex as well. Now we are about to compare the private outcome with the social outcome, where the private outcome is characterized by private decisions of agents in absence of regulation, which leads to inefficiencies if there are market failures. The social outcome instead is characterized by the decision of a social planner whose objective is to maximize social welfare in order to reach efficiency. So the social planner aims to correct for externalities or equivalently internalize externalities in her decisions. If there is no regulation, which is the case of laissez-faire scenario, each firm maximizes profits by choosing Qi and Ai, taking the price P on the market as given. So the profits is the revenue P times Qi minus the total cost Ci of Qi Ai. The firm maximizes her profit over her two decision variables, Qi and Ai now. The first order conditions are as follows. Over Qi, we get that the price is equal to the marginal cost of production. And over Ai, we get that the marginal cost of abatement, so the cost of reducing one additional unit of emission, is equal to 0. So the first condition says that the firm selects its optimal level of output to maximize profits by equating the marginal benefits of an extra unit of output to the marginal cost of producing this unit. The second condition states that abatement AI is optimally chosen when the marginal cost of abatement is equal to the marginal benefits of abatement. But actually, the marginal benefit of the firm of abating one additional unit of emission is zero, since from an individual firm's point of view, there is no benefit of abatement because abating emissions reduces production and thus profits. So it is clear that abatement will be chosen so that it is equal to zero. The firm does not abate emissions at all in the laissez-faire scenario. Now we want to maximize social welfare, so we asked what a social planner or the government would do. The social planner maximizes the sum of profits minus the cost of total emissions, DE. So the welfare function is the sum of profits over all firms minus the damage from aggregate emissions produced by all firms. And that leads to our first order conditions, one with respect to QI and the other one with respect to AI. With respect to QI, we get that the price is equal to the marginal cost of production plus the marginal damage times the emission from an additional unit of good produced. With respect to AI, we get that minus the marginal cost of abatement is equal to the marginal damage times the emission from an additional unit of abatement. The first condition basically states that the social planner equates the marginal benefit of production with the marginal cost of production plus the marginal damage imposed on society. So this means that for any given level of abatement AI, the social planner chooses a quantity QI that is lower than what the firms would choose themselves. The second condition says that the social planner equates the marginal cost of abatement with the marginal benefit of abatement, which is the lower marginal damage from emissions because higher abatement induces less emissions, which implies less damage from emissions. Remember that before, with no regulation, we had a zero marginal benefit from abatement from individual firms' point of view. But now, clearly, we have a positive benefit because society benefits from less emissions. So all this means that for any given level of production QI, the social planner chooses an abatement level AI that is higher than what the firms would choose themselves. Let's summarize the comparison between the laissez-faire scenario and the social optimum. The socially optimal production level is clearly lower and the socially optimal abatement level higher than the laissez-faire levels that firms would choose individually with no regulation. But the socially optimal production and abatement levels are Pareto efficient, so what the social planner chooses is always Pareto efficient. The task now is to find policy instruments that implement such Pareto efficient outputs and abatement levels. Which instruments exist? It's not simple to categorize all instruments, but roughly we can say that there are some instruments which use markets, some that create markets. There's also a kind of command and control regulation. And finally, there are instruments that involve and engage the public. Among instruments which use the market, there are subsidy reductions, environmental taxes and charges, user charges, and deposit refund schemes, as well as targeted subsidies. To give you an idea of what these instruments are, subsidy reduction could be a reduction of subsidies for fossil fuels in some developing countries. Environmental taxes and charges could be carbon taxes or CO2 taxes. User charges are charges for example, treating wastewater or waste disposal. And deposit refund schemes impose a surcharge on a product when you buy it, but you get a rebate when the product is returned. Targeted subsidies could be subsidies for clean technologies, for example. So basically we say that in general, all these instruments use markets in the sense that they can adjust prices on the market to internalize the externality. Regarding the instruments which create markets, there are property rights that can be assigned, tradable rights and permits to pollute, for example, and international offset systems, which allow countries with a commitment to reduce its own emissions to implement projects which reduce emissions in another country. An example of this is the Clean Development Mechanism that is operational in the Kyoto Protocol. When it comes to regulations, we can think of standards like emission standards, bans of certain technologies, permits and quotas, in the sense that firms are not allowed to emit more than a certain amount of emissions. There's also zoning, which means that areas of land are divided by authorities and only certain types of technologies or cars, for example, are allowed in certain zones. And one can impose some kind of liability for environmentally harmful emissions. Finally, instruments that engage the public are basically instruments that disclose information on environmental performance, for example. To sum up, we can say that in the absence of any regulation, firms would choose production levels that are higher and abatement levels that are lower than the socially optimal levels. Therefore, to reach efficiency in the presence of a market failure, there is clearly a need to implement environmental policy instruments, and there is a variety of policy instruments available. So now the question is, which instruments are the best for each type of environmental problem?